He came to sell his father's mill, but found a legacy worth saving. The road into Oak Creek curved between tall pines that looked exactly the same as they had 20 years ago. Evan slowed the car without realizing it, watching the familiar tree line move past the windshield like an old memory that had been waiting quietly for him to return. The town sign appeared ahead, Oak Creek, population 2,184. Someone had repainted it recently, but the wood beneath still carried the cracks of age. Evan exhaled slowly. He had spent 12 years building a life far away from this place. 12 years in glass offices, conference rooms, and airports, where problems had numbers and solutions could be signed on paper. Oak Creek had never worked that way. Oak Creek remembered things. He drove past the gas station first. The same rusting canopy. The same crooked soda machine outside. Only the cars had changed. A pickup truck pulled away as he passed, the driver staring for a moment longer than necessary. Word traveled quickly in towns like this. If someone unfamiliar appeared, the entire town would know before sunset. And Evan was not exactly unfamiliar. He was the son who had left. The main street looked smaller than he remembered. When he was a teenager, it had felt like the center of a world. Now it was a strip of quiet buildings pressed between the forest and the river valley. The bakery still stood on the corner, though the sign had faded. The grocery store windows held a new layer of paint. The diner across the street had the same neon coffee cup, glowing weakly even in daylight. Evan kept driving without stopping. If he paused anywhere, someone would come out to ask questions, and questions meant explanations. He had not come back for conversations. His phone buzzed once in the cup holder. A message from the bank. A reminder about the loan schedule. Evan muted the notification and placed the phone face down. That was the real reason he had driven 6 hours to return here. Numbers. Debts. Deadlines. His father had died 2 weeks earlier from a stroke in the small house near the mill. The hospital had called him because his name was the only contact left in the records. Evan had arrived too late to say anything that mattered. The funeral had been small. The paperwork had been large. The road narrowed as it left town and descended toward the river valley. Evan turned onto the gravel path that led to the old lumber mill. Dust lifted behind the tires and drifted slowly through the trees. The smell reached him before the buildings appeared. Damp wood, cold water from the river, and the faint metallic scent of machinery that had once run every day. The mill finally came into view between the pines. It looked abandoned at first glance. The main structure stood beside the riverbank, its long roof stretching over a line of silent saw frames. The loading platform was empty. The rail track that once carried logs from the forest had rusted into a dark brown line disappearing into weeds. Wind moved through broken slats in the walls, creating a low, hollow sound like breath moving through an empty room. Evan stopped the car and stepped out. Gravel crunched under his shoes. The river moved steadily beside the property, carrying pale reflections of the cloudy sky. For a moment, he simply stood there with his hands in his pockets, studying the place without emotion. This land covered nearly 40 acres between the hillside and the river bend. In the city, it would have been worth a fortune. Here it was an aging industrial scar sitting next to protected forest land. He walked toward the main building. The wooden doors hung slightly open, just enough to reveal the dark interior. Evan pushed them wider. Dust floated in the sunlight that cut through the high windows. The sawmill machines were still in place. Long steel arms, heavy circular blades. Conveyor tracks coated with years of sawdust hardened into pale ridges. Nothing had moved in months. His father had kept working here long after most small mills closed. Evan had never understood why. The numbers never worked. Big companies processed timber faster and cheaper. Oak Creek's forests were limited by environmental regulations. The town itself barely needed the mill anymore. Yet Arthur had stayed, waking before dawn, walking down this same gravel path every morning as if the routine itself was the reason to continue. Evan crossed the floor slowly. His footsteps echoed against the metal frames. A narrow office stood in the corner, its door closed. He opened it and found exactly what he expected: a desk stacked with paperwork, a calendar that still showed last month, and a coffee mug sitting beside a small radio. The chair behind the desk remained pushed slightly back as if his father had stood up and planned to return within minutes. Evan opened one of the drawers. Property maps filled the folder inside. Survey lines marked the edges of the land. The river curved across the lower section. Beyond the northern boundary lay a shaded area labeled as protected woodland. The boundary between the mill property and the reserve had always been complicated. Lawyers had argued about it for years. Evan closed the folder again. Those arguments no longer mattered. Once he sold the land, the responsibility would belong to someone else. A truck engine sounded outside. Evan stepped out of the office and looked through the doorway. A dark green pickup rolled slowly onto the gravel lot and stopped near the riverbank. The driver turned off the engine and stepped down. For a second, Evan didn't recognize her because the years had changed small details. The posture remained the same, though. Straight shoulders. Calm, steady movements. Nora. She walked toward the building without hesitation, boots crunching on the gravel. Her hair was pulled back in a loose knot, and a folder rested under one arm. When she reached the doorway, she stopped a few steps away, studying Evan as if measuring the distance between who he used to be and who had returned. "So it's true," she said finally. "You're back." Evan leaned lightly against the door frame. Not for long. Her gaze shifted briefly across the mill interior before returning to him. "I heard about your father." He nodded once. 2 weeks ago. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the river moving outside. Nora stepped into the building and placed the folder on a nearby work table. "People in town assumed you'd sell the place." "That's the plan." She studied his face carefully as if looking for hesitation and finding none. "Already talking to buyers?" "I will be." Nora opened the folder. Inside were several printed maps and environmental reports. She spread them across the table with deliberate precision. Evan watched without approaching. "You probably remember the forest north of your land," she said. "Of course. It became a protected reserve 5 years ago. I read the notice." She pointed to the map. "Your property line runs along the southern edge of that reserve. If industrial construction begins here," she tapped the area where the mill stood, "it affects the river system that feeds the wetlands inside the protected zone." Evan crossed his arms. "You came here to explain environmental policy?" "I came because whoever buys this land will ask the same questions eventually." "I'm sure they will." Nora looked directly at him again, her voice steady. "And because the rumor in town says the mayor is interested." Evan's expression remained neutral, but the name settled heavily in the air. "Tom Gray." Nora watched his reaction closely. "He's planning something large," she continued. "A development project outside town. Industrial facilities. Transport routes. If he gains access through this land, the river corridor becomes vulnerable." Evan pushed himself away from the doorway and walked toward the table. The maps showed colored zones marking wildlife habitats and water flow patterns. Technical language filled the margins. "I didn't come back to manage a conservation project," he said calmly. "I know. Then you understand why I'm selling." Nora folded her arms. "I understand debt. I understand leaving town when you're young because the world looks bigger somewhere else." "Good. But I also understand what this river supports." Her finger moved along the blue line crossing the map. "If the wrong construction happens here, the damage spreads miles beyond your property." Evan studied the map quietly for a moment before sliding it back toward her. "That's a conversation for the buyer. You're the one signing the first contract. And that contract clears my responsibilities." Nora's eyes narrowed slightly, though her tone stayed controlled. "Legally, maybe." Evan gave a short breath of amusement. "You haven't changed." "No. Still convinced every problem can be solved if people just listen to you. And you still think every problem disappears once a contract is signed." Their words landed sharper now, but neither raised their voice. Evan turned away from the table and looked through the open doors toward the river. The current moved steadily between the stones, carrying leaves downstream. The forest beyond the opposite bank stood thick and silent. "This place was dying long before I left," he said. "The mill stopped making money years ago. That doesn't mean the land has no value." "It has plenty of value," Evan replied. "That's exactly why I'm selling it." Nora gathered the maps back into her folder, her movements precise again. "If you sell to Gray, the project won't stop with a road." Evan glanced over his shoulder. "You seem very sure. I've seen the preliminary proposals. And they go far beyond what he tells the town council." Evan watched her closely now. The confidence in her voice carried the weight of real information, not speculation. For a moment the room felt smaller, filled with possibilities neither of them had planned to confront today. But Evan pushed the thought aside. He walked toward the exit, stopping beside her on the way. I'm here to settle the estate, he said quietly. Not to fight the mayor. Nora held his gaze for a long second. Then settle it carefully, she replied. Evan stepped outside into the pale afternoon light. The wind had shifted, carrying the scent of the forest down toward the river. Behind him, the mill remained silent, its long roof stretching across the clearing like a memory waiting for someone to decide whether it should disappear or begin again. Evan stood beside his car for a moment, watching the river move past the gravel bank. Behind him, Nora closed the mill doors with a dull wooden thud. She didn't speak, and neither did he. She simply climbed into her truck and drove back up the gravel road, the dust following her tires for a long time before settling again. The road climbed slightly along the edge of the forest before opening onto a narrow clearing where the small wooden building stood. The house looked older than the mill somehow, though it had been built years later. Maybe it was the porch railing leaning slightly to one side, or the dark stains where rainwater had carved lines along the outer wall. Evan parked beside the shed and stepped out. The air carried the smell of pine needles and damp soil. Somewhere deeper in the forest a bird called once and then fell silent. He walked onto the porch and unlocked the door. Inside, the house felt colder than expected. The furniture remained exactly where it had always been. The old couch facing the narrow television, the kitchen table beside the window, the bookshelf filled with manuals about timber cutting and equipment repair. A jacket still hung on the back of a chair. Evan stepped inside slowly, letting the door close behind him. The quiet here felt different from the quiet at the mill. The mill had been empty because work had stopped. The house was empty because a life had ended. Evan set his bag on the table and walked through the rooms one by one. The bedroom contained little more than a narrow bed and a dresser. The bathroom mirror had a crack along the corner that he vaguely remembered from years ago. In the back room Nora had mentioned, a dark stain spread across part of the ceiling where rain had seeped through the roof. He returned to the kitchen and sat at the table. For a while he simply listened to the house settling around him. The faint creak of wood. The wind moving outside. Then he opened the folder the lawyer had given him. Inside were the documents he needed to finalize the estate. Property titles, tax records, maintenance reports for the mill machinery, and several handwritten notes from his father. Evan flipped through them methodically. Numbers first. Land valuation estimates. Equipment resale value. Outstanding taxes from the last 2 years. He pulled a notepad closer and began writing calculations. If the land sold near market value, the bank loan could be cleared entirely. The remaining amount might even leave enough for him to walk away without financial damage. The mill itself had almost no value anymore, but the land along the river remained attractive for development. That was the part buyers wanted. After 20 minutes, Evan leaned back slightly in the chair. The numbers worked. The only problem was time. Selling to Gray would mean the bank was paid by the end of the month, and he could be back in the city before the first snow. It was the only logical exit, regardless of whatever secrets the valley was hiding. It was the only logical exit, regardless of whatever secrets the valley was hiding. The bank expected payment within 3 months. That meant the land had to be sold quickly, ideally within the next few weeks. Evan rubbed the bridge of his nose and looked around the quiet kitchen again. A knock sounded on the front door. Evan frowned slightly and stood up. Few people in Oak Creek knocked without already knowing the person inside. He walked to the door and opened it. Tom Gray stood on the porch. The mayor looked exactly the way Evan remembered him from town meetings years earlier. Tall, broad shoulders, perfectly ironed shirt even in the middle of the afternoon. His gray hair was neatly combed, and his smile carried the careful warmth of a man used to speaking in public. "Evan," Gray said pleasantly. "I hoped I'd find you here." Evan stepped aside slightly, but did not invite him in. "Mayor." Gray glanced past him into the house before returning his attention to Evan. "First, my condolences about your father. Arthur was a stubborn man, but he cared deeply about this town." "Thank you." Gray rested one hand lightly on the porch railing. "I imagine you're dealing with a mountain of paperwork." "That's accurate." "Well," Gray continued, his voice calm and measured, "perhaps I can make part of that process easier." Evan watched him carefully now. "How?" "I understand you're considering selling the mill property." "Considering, yes." Gray nodded, as if confirming information he already knew. "The town council has been discussing a regional development project for some time now. Infrastructure improvements. New business opportunities. The valley has potential that's been underused for decades. Evan remained silent. The key obstacle, Gray continued, is transportation access. The main highway sits 8 miles west of town. Any large project requires a direct route from that highway to the valley floor. Evan's gaze sharpened slightly. And that route crosses my land. Precisely. Gray smiled again, though his eyes remained calculating. A private access road across the southern edge of your property would solve the issue entirely. Evan leaned one shoulder against the door frame. You're proposing the town buys the land? Not the entire parcel. Only the necessary corridor for the road. That's still a significant portion. Gray shrugged lightly, which is why we're prepared to offer a generous price. Evan crossed his arms. Define generous. The mayor reached into his jacket and removed a thin folder. He opened it and handed Evan a printed sheet. Evan glanced down at the number written near the bottom. It was exactly triple the market value he had calculated earlier. For a road? Evan asked, his voice flat with disbelief. For cooperation. Evan studied Gray's expression, searching for signs of impatience or pressure. The mayor appeared relaxed, confident. You'd still own the majority of the land, Gray added. The town simply gains passage rights along the edge. Evan tapped the paper lightly with one finger. And construction begins immediately, as soon as the agreement is signed. That seems fast. Gray's smile widened slightly. Progress favors those who act quickly. Evan folded the paper once and handed it back. I'll review it. Gray accepted the sheet without argument. Of course. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Gray glanced toward the forest line beyond the house. You've probably already spoken with Nora, he said casually. Evan did not react. Why would you assume that? She has strong opinions about development. That's one way to describe them. Gray chuckled softly. The environmental fund she runs means well, but sometimes they forget that small towns must grow to survive. Evan kept his tone neutral. Growth is expensive. That's why investors are interested. Gray closed the folder and slid it back into his jacket. Take a day or two to think about the offer. I'd prefer to move forward quickly, but I understand you need time. Evan nodded once. I'll contact you. The mayor stepped away from the door, adjusting his cuffs. I look forward to hearing from you. He walked down the porch steps and crossed the clearing toward a dark sedan parked beside the road. Evan watched as the car started and disappeared between the trees. The forest fell silent again. Evan remained standing in the doorway for several seconds before returning inside. He sat at the kitchen table and stared at the documents spread across the surface. Then he opened his notepad again and rewrote the numbers using Gray's offer instead of the original estimate. The result erased every debt completely. Not only that, it left a large amount remaining. Enough to rebuild his life without pressure. Enough to walk away from Oak Creek permanently. Evan leaned back in the chair and looked toward the window where the river valley stretched beyond the trees. Nora's voice echoed faintly in his memory. If you sell to Gray, the project won't stop with a road. Evan closed the notepad. For the first time since arriving in Oak Creek, the decision in front of him felt less simple than he had expected. Morning arrived slowly in Oak Creek. A thin gray light filtered through the trees behind the house, turning the mist above the valley into a pale, drifting veil. Evan woke earlier than he expected. For a few seconds, he didn't remember where he was. Then the creak of the old house and the distant sound of the river settled the memory back into place. He sat on the edge of the bed and rubbed his eyes. The quiet here felt deeper than the quiet in the city. In the city, silence meant something had stopped. Here, silence meant the world had not started moving yet. Evan walked into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water. The paperwork from the night before still covered the table. Gray's number remained written in the center of the page. He studied it again. The offer solved everything. No negotiations, no waiting for uncertain buyers, no slow legal process. Sign the agreement, allow the road construction, and the money would clear the debts within days. From a purely practical perspective, it was the easiest decision he could make. Evan grabbed his jacket and stepped outside. The cold morning air felt sharper than the day before, a physical reminder of the debt he was still carrying. He had come here to settle the estate and leave, but the house felt more like a trap than a legacy. The mill stood exactly as it had the day before, silent beside the riverbank. Evan unlocked the doors and stepped inside. Dust still floated in the beams of early sunlight cutting through the upper windows. He walked along the main floor slowly, examining the machinery with a more careful eye than he had the day before. Most of the equipment was outdated but intact. The steel frames showed rust along the edges, yet the heavy saw units looked capable of running again with enough maintenance. His father had never been careless with machines. Evan stopped beside the main conveyor track and rested his hand against the cold metal surface. For a moment, he imagined the building filled with noise again. The grind of engines, the movement of timber, the voices of workers shouting over the sound of the blades. But that world had disappeared years ago. Evan turned toward the small office in the corner. Yesterday, he had only opened the first drawer. This time, he pulled the chair out and began checking the rest of the desk. Folders filled most of the compartments. Maintenance logs, equipment manuals, old tax receipts. In the bottom drawer, he found a narrow metal box locked with a simple latch. The key hung from a small hook taped to the inside of the drawer. Evan opened the box. Inside were several older documents wrapped in plastic sleeves. Property maps again, but these looked different from the copies he had seen before. The paper carried hand-drawn notes along the edges. Boundary lines had been traced in red pencil with small corrections written beside them. Evan lifted the first map and spread it across the desk. The northern border of the property was marked clearly. Beyond it, the land shifted into a shaded region labeled as protected woodland. However, the red pencil notes suggested the boundary had been measured again at some point. A thin line extended slightly farther north than the official survey showed. Evan leaned closer. If the corrected line was accurate, the mill property reached deeper into the forest edge than the legal documents currently recorded. Not by a huge distance, perhaps 50 or 60 meters, but enough to affect the corridor where Gray intended to build the road. Evan studied the markings carefully. His father's handwriting appeared in the margins, measurement dates, coordinates, and small arrows pointing toward landmarks near the riverbank. He checked the rest of the documents in the box. Several letters from surveyors dated almost 10 years earlier confirmed the same thing. The original boundary between the mill land and the woodland had been recorded incorrectly decades ago. Arthur had tried to have the correction recognized officially, but the request had never been processed by the county office. Evan sat back slowly. If these measurements were valid, the land Gray wanted to cross might not belong entirely to the town's development zone after all. Part of the corridor could fall inside protected territory connected to the reserve. A voice spoke behind him. "You found the old maps." Evan turned. Nora stood in the doorway of the office holding a metal thermos. She looked less surprised than he expected. "You've been coming here early," Evan said. "Most mornings." She stepped inside and placed the thermos on the desk. "Your father showed me those documents a few years ago." Evan tapped the map lightly. "Why didn't the boundary change officially?" The county survey office said the correction needed additional environmental review, and they delayed it. For 10 years. Nora gave a small shrug. Things move slowly when land development might be involved. Evan studied the map again. "Gray knows about this?" "I'm not sure. But you suspected." "I suspected your father had found something important," she replied calmly. "That's why I came today." Evan folded his arms. "You expected me to discover it. I expected you to start looking." He considered her words for a moment before asking, "How much of the road corridor would cross the reserve if this correction is real?" "Enough to stop construction until federal environmental studies are completed." "That could take years." "Yes." Evan walked out of the office and onto the main mill floor. Nora followed a moment later. Sunlight had climbed higher now, illuminating the long, empty building more clearly. "You're hoping I'll use this to block Gray's project," he said. "I'm hoping you'll understand the situation before signing anything." Evan leaned against one of the steel support beams. "You could have shown me these maps yesterday. I wanted you to see them with your own eyes. So it feels more convincing. So you trust the evidence instead of my opinion." Evan looked back toward the office where the documents still lay on the desk. The situation was shifting faster than he expected. Gray wanted the contract signed quickly. Nora was quietly revealing reasons why that speed might be dangerous. And now the property boundaries themselves were uncertain. "You realize this complicates everything," Evan said. Nora nodded. "Yes. I came here to sell land, not start a legal dispute." "You didn't start it. Signing Gray's deal might." Nora opened the thermos and poured coffee into the lid. The smell spread through the room instantly. She offered it to him. Evan accepted after a short hesitation. For a moment, they stood near the open mill doors, drinking coffee and looking out at the river. "No matter what you decide," Nora said eventually, "the town will learn about this soon." "How?" "Gray will push the project forward publicly once he secures the land. And if he doesn't secure it, then he'll look for another way." Evan finished the coffee and handed the lid back. The quiet returned again, filled only by the sound of the river outside and the distant wind moving through the trees. For the first time since arriving in Oak Creek, the land beneath his feet no longer felt like a simple asset waiting to be sold. It felt like the center of a conflict that had already begun long before he came back. The sun climbed higher above the valley, pushing pale light through the tall windows of the mill. Dust particles floated slowly in the air like tiny drifting sparks. Evan stood near the open doors with his hands in his pockets, watching the river cut its steady path along the edge of the property. Behind him, Nora returned the documents to the metal box carefully, placing each plastic sleeve back in the same order she had found them. The quiet between them felt different now. Yesterday, their conversation had been an argument. This morning, it felt more like two people standing at the edge of the same problem. Evan finally turned around. "How long have you known about those maps?" he asked. "About 4 years. And you never tried to use them publicly?" Nora closed the box and locked it again. "We couldn't." "Why not?" "Because they weren't officially recognized. Without confirmation from the county survey office, they're just notes on paper." Evan leaned against the door frame. "But they're accurate. Your father believed they were." "That's not the same thing as proof." "No," Nora agreed calmly. "It isn't." Evan stepped back into the office and looked again at the desk where the maps had been spread earlier. The handwriting in the margins was unmistakably Arthur's. His father had always been precise with numbers and measurements. If he believed the survey was wrong, he would not have written corrections without checking them repeatedly. Still, belief and legal evidence were very different things. "You think Gray knows about this?" Evan said. "I think he suspects something," Nora replied. "Otherwise, he wouldn't be pushing the agreement so quickly." Evan thought about the mayor's calm smile on the porch the day before. The confidence in his voice had not sounded like someone uncertain about the land he wanted. "He offered more than double the market value," Evan said. Nora raised an eyebrow slightly. "That much?" "Yes. That explains the urgency." Evan crossed his arms again. "Or it means the project is profitable enough to justify the price. Those two possibilities aren't mutually exclusive." He exhaled slowly. "You enjoy making simple choices complicated." "No," Nora replied quietly. "I just prefer seeing the full picture before decisions are made." Evan looked at her for a moment. The years had changed her in small ways. The confidence in her voice felt stronger than he remembered. The sharp edge in her eyes had not disappeared, though. She had always been like that, focused, stubborn, unwilling to step away from something she believed was important. "Why are you really here this morning?" he asked. Nora hesitated for the first time. "Because the Foundation's board meets tomorrow," she said eventually. "If the town moves forward with Gray's project, they'll have to decide whether to challenge it legally. And you want evidence before that meeting." "I want clarity." Evan nodded slowly. "You're hoping I'll delay signing anything." "I'm hoping you'll investigate first." He stepped past her and walked back onto the main mill floor. The building looked different now that the morning sun had filled it completely. The steel beams cast long shadows across the sawdust-covered ground. Evan approached the conveyor track again. "My father kept this place running long after the numbers stopped making sense," he said. Nora nodded. "He believed the land would eventually matter to someone who understood why it should stay the way it is." Evan let out a quiet breath. "That's a lot of faith to place in the future." "Your father was a stubborn man." That part one remember. A truck engine echoed faintly from the direction of the main road. Evan turned toward the open doors as the sound grew louder. A dark sedan appeared at the edge of the clearing and rolled slowly toward the mill. The sunlight reflected off the windshield, hiding the driver's face until the car stopped near the gravel lot. The door opened. Tom Gray stepped out. Evan felt a brief flash of irritation. "He works fast." Nora's expression hardened slightly. "That was quicker than I expected." Gray adjusted his jacket as he walked toward the building. His confident smile returned the moment he saw them both standing inside. "Well," he said pleasantly, stopping just outside the doors. "This saves me a trip around town looking for you." Evan crossed his arms. "What brings you back so soon?" "I had a feeling you might be here." Gray's eyes shifted briefly toward Nora before returning to Evan. Miss Caldwell. Mayor, she replied calmly. He stepped inside the mill, his shoes crunching lightly against the sawdust on the floor. The mayor looked around the building with an appraising expression, as if measuring its size against invisible blueprints in his mind. A remarkable structure, he said. Your father kept it in impressive condition considering the industry changes. He did what he could, Evan replied. Gray nodded thoughtfully, which is why the town wants to ensure the property continues to serve a useful purpose. Nora remained silent, watching him closely. The mayor finally turned his attention fully to Evan again. I realize yesterday's offer may have come unexpectedly, he continued. But the development schedule is tight, and investors prefer clarity. Evan leaned against the metal beam beside him. You didn't mention investors yesterday. Gray smiled slightly. Large projects rarely happen without them. And they're already involved? Interested. Evan glanced briefly toward Nora before speaking again. Before I consider signing anything, I need more information about the road. Gray tilted his head slightly. What kind of information? Construction plans. Environmental studies. The exact route across the property. The mayor's smile remained steady, but something in his eyes shifted for a fraction of a second. All of that will be available during the formal planning stage, he replied smoothly. I'd prefer to see it before agreeing. That isn't standard procedure. Evan shrugged. Neither is offering triple the market price for a narrow strip of land. Gray studied him carefully now. The friendly tone in his voice remained, but the warmth had cooled slightly. You're being cautious, he said. I'm being thorough. The mayor glanced toward Nora again. I hope you're not letting outside opinions complicate a simple transaction. Nora spoke before Evan could answer. Transparency rarely complicates anything. Gray chuckled softly. Transparency is a luxury small towns cannot always afford when opportunity arrives. Evan stepped forward slightly, drawing the mayor's attention back. Then give me the details, he said. Gray held his gaze for a moment. The smile slowly returned, controlled and polite. I'll arrange a meeting, the mayor replied. Tomorrow afternoon at the town office. I'll bring the preliminary documents. Evan nodded once. Good. Gray turned toward the exit, pausing briefly beside Nora. I admire your dedication to the valley, Miss Caldwell, he said quietly. But progress is rarely stopped by paperwork. Nora met his gaze without flinching. Progress built on hidden plans tends to collapse eventually. The mayor's smile flickered again before he stepped outside and returned to his car. The engine started, and the sedan rolled away through the clearing. The sound faded quickly into the forest. The sound of Gray's sedan disappeared into the forest road, leaving the clearing quiet again. For a few seconds, neither Evan nor Nora moved. The mill stood around them in the bright late-morning light, the steel beams throwing sharp shadows across the floor. Evan finally exhaled and rubbed the back of his neck. He didn't like that question, he said. Nora leaned against the support beam, watching the empty doorway where the mayor had just stood. No. He expected a quick signature. He expected you to behave like someone who came back only to sell land. Evan gave a short, humorless breath, which was exactly the plan. Nora pushed away from the beam and walked toward the office. Plans change when new information appears. Evan followed her slowly, or when someone decides to complicate them. Nora glanced at him but didn't respond to the remark. She unlocked the metal box again and removed one of the survey documents. You should bring copies of these tomorrow, she said. Evan leaned against the door frame. Why? Because if Gray's corridor touches the reserve boundary, the project needs federal review. And you want to see his reaction when he realizes that. Nora slid the document back into its sleeve. I want to know whether he already realizes it. Evan considered that for a moment. If he does, he'll deny it. Probably. And if he doesn't, then tomorrow might be the first time someone mentions it in front of him. Evan looked out across the mill floor again. The machine still carried the quiet weight of a place built for work that no longer happened. Let's assume the boundary correction is valid, he said slowly. What happens next? Environmental assessment. How long? Months at minimum. Possibly longer. Evan crossed his arms again. Which means investors start losing patience. Yes. And the project stalls. That's usually how these things go. Evan nodded thoughtfully. You're very calm about something that could turn into a serious legal fight. Nora gave a small shrug. Legal fights happen all the time when people try to build industrial roads next to protected ecosystems. You sound experienced. I've had practice. Evan walked across the room toward the large mill doors again. Outside, the sunlight had grown stronger, reflecting off the river's surface in broken flashes of silver. I came back here expecting 3 days of paperwork, he said. Nora followed him a moment later. And now I'm apparently standing in the middle of a development conflict. Welcome back to Oak Creek. Evan looked sideways at her. You don't sound surprised. I'm not. Why? Nora leaned against the door frame beside him, folding her arms loosely. Because Gray has been preparing something like this for almost a year. Evan frowned slightly. You knew that. I suspected it. And you didn't warn anyone? I did. But without proof, the town council doesn't move against the mayor. Evan watched the river again. So you waited. I watched. And hoped someone else would become part of the equation. Nora looked at him directly. I hoped the landowner would care enough to ask questions. Evan let out a quiet breath. That's a risky strategy. Sometimes it's the only one. The conversation paused as a breeze moved through the open mill doors, carrying the scent of pine and cold water. After a moment, Evan stepped outside onto the gravel clearing. Nora followed. The riverbank stretched only a few meters away, its edge lined with smooth stones and patches of grass. Evan walked toward the water slowly. This river looks smaller than I remember, he said. It's lower in late summer, Nora replied. He crouched near the edge and dipped his hand briefly into the current. The water felt colder than expected. When we were kids, he said quietly, this place felt enormous. Nora smiled faintly. Everything feels enormous when you're 15. Evan stood again. We used to swim right over there. He pointed toward a bend in the river where the water deepened slightly. Nora nodded. You jumped from the old log bridge once, she said. Evan raised an eyebrow. You remember that? You broke your wrist. That's not how I remember it. That's because you spent most of that afternoon pretending nothing happened. Evan laughed quietly for the first time since arriving in Oak Creek. The sound surprised both of them slightly. The moment passed quickly, though. Nora looked back toward the mill. The board meeting tomorrow morning will be tense. You're planning to tell them about Gray's offer. Yes. And the boundary maps. If you allow it. Evan studied the river again before answering. You can mention the possibility. But the documents stay with me until I confirm the survey. That's fair. He turned toward the mill building once more. The wooden walls looked older in the bright sunlight, but the structure remained solid. My father tried to correct those boundaries 10 years ago, Evan said. Yes. And nobody listened. County offices are slow when development money is involved. Evan nodded slowly. Then maybe it's time someone looks again. Nora studied him carefully. You're starting to sound like you're staying longer than 3 days. Don't read too much into it. I'm reading exactly what you're saying. Evan glanced at her with a faint smirk. You always did that. And I was usually right. Before he could answer, a sharp sound echoed from the direction of the forest road. Both of them turned instinctively. A plume of dust rose above the trees at the edge of the clearing. For a moment, it looked like another vehicle approaching the mill. But the sound that followed was not an engine. It was a sudden crack, sharp and dry, like wood splitting under pressure. Evan's eyes narrowed. Did you hear that? He asked. Nora nodded slowly. Yes. Another crack followed a few seconds later, deeper this time, echoing through the valley. Evan walked toward the edge of the clearing, looking into the forest line. A thin column of gray smoke began to rise above the trees beyond the northern boundary of the property. Nora stepped beside him, her expression tightening. That's near the reserve edge, she said quietly. Evan watched the smoke grow thicker against the sky. Looks like something just caught fire. The thin column of smoke above the trees thickened within seconds, turning from pale gray to darker streaks that drifted slowly across the sky. Evan stood at the edge of the gravel clearing, staring into the forest line where the northern boundary of the property disappeared into dense pine. Nora stepped forward beside him. That's too close to the reserve, she said quietly. Evan narrowed his eyes, trying to judge the distance. The smoke rose from somewhere beyond the slope where the land dipped toward the wetlands. The trees there were thick and old. If a fire had started inside that area, it could spread quickly through the dry underbrush. Could be someone burning debris, Evan said. Nora shook her head immediately. Not inside that section. Open burning has been restricted there for years. Another sharp crack echoed faintly from the forest. Evan turned toward the mill building. There's a water pump here somewhere. Yes, near the equipment shed. They moved quickly across the clearing. The shed stood behind the mill beside an old steel tank that had once supplied water pressure for the saw cooling system. Evan opened the shed door and scanned the interior. Coiled hoses hung along the wall. The portable pump unit sat near the back, exactly where it had been years ago. "Still here," he muttered. Nora grabbed one of the hoses while Evan checked the pump engine. Dust covered the casing, but the fuel tank still held a small amount of gasoline. He pulled the starter cord once. The engine coughed weakly. "Come on," he said under his breath, pulling again. The third pull brought a wet cough from the engine, then nothing. Evan adjusted the choke, his hands moving with a memory of the machine he hadn't used in years. On the fifth try, the engine caught, roaring into a shaky, uneven idle. Nora had already dragged the intake hose to the river, her movements practiced and efficient. Within a minute, the system was drawing water from the river and pushing it through the hose with steady pressure. Evan looked toward the rising smoke again. "That's still a few hundred meters inside the trees," he said. Nora tightened her grip on the hose. "Then we should move." They followed a narrow path along the northern edge of the property. The ground sloped slightly upward before leveling near the forest boundary. The smell reached them before the fire itself became visible, a sharp scent of burning bark and dry leaves. When they reached the edge of the trees, Evan stopped. Flames flickered low across a patch of brush roughly 15 meters wide. The fire had not climbed into the trees yet, but it moved quickly across the dry grass beneath them. Thin branches snapped as the heat spread outward. "Damn," Evan said quietly. Nora pointed toward the left side of the burning area. "If we cut it off there, it won't reach the thicker brush." Evan nodded once. "Start on that side." He opened the hose valve, and a strong stream of river water blasted across the flames. Steam rose instantly where the water struck the burning ground. Nora moved along the edge of the fire, soaking the dry grass ahead of its path. For several minutes they worked in silence, focusing only on controlling the spread. The fire fought back with small bursts of heat, but the steady flow of water slowly pushed it into retreat. After 10 minutes, the flames shrank to scattered patches of smoldering brush. Evan directed the hose across the remaining hot spots until only smoke remained. He shut off the valve and lowered the hose. The forest grew quiet again. Only thin wisps of smoke drifted upward through the branches. Nora wiped a streak of soot from her arm and looked around carefully. That was too clean. Evan glanced at her. "What do you mean?" She crouched near the center of the burned patch and brushed aside a blackened branch. Beneath it lay a small metal canister, half melted by the heat. "Accelerant," she said. Evan walked closer. The smell of fuel still clung to the air around the object. This didn't start naturally. No. He scanned the surrounding trees. Anyone could have come through here during the night. Nora stood slowly. Anyone who wanted the fire to move toward the reserve. Evan crossed his arms again. "That's a serious accusation. I'm stating a possibility." He looked back toward the mill property behind them. The distance from the clearing to this burned patch was not far. If the flames had spread farther before being noticed, they could have reached the forest line bordering the protected area. "You think someone wanted the reserve damaged," he said quietly, "or wanted to prove it's vulnerable?" Evan exhaled slowly. "Either way, this is going to bring attention." "Yes. And attention means investigators." Nora nodded. "Forest Service, county fire inspectors, possibly environmental officers." Evan looked down at the blackened ground again. "Convenient timing," he said. Nora met his gaze. "You're thinking the same thing I am. That Grays project would face fewer objections if the reserve suddenly looked unstable or dangerous." Evan kicked a piece of charred wood aside. "That's speculation." "Yes, but the fire still happened." Nora folded her arms. "And it happened less than 24 hours after he offered you a contract." The air between them grew heavier. Evan stared at the remains of the accelerant canister for several seconds before speaking again. "We report it," he said. "Of course. But we don't accuse anyone." "I wasn't planning to." Evan picked up the metal container carefully with a piece of cloth from his pocket. The object was warm, but no longer hot. He studied it briefly before placing it on a flat stone nearby. "If investigators find this," he said, "they'll know the fire wasn't natural." Nora looked toward the river valley beyond the trees. That alone could delay Gray's timeline. Evan nodded slowly, which means tomorrow's meeting just became even more important. They walked back toward the mill in silence. The pump still hummed beside the riverbank where they had left it running. Evan shut off the engine and coiled the hose again, while Nora rinsed the soot from her hands in the water. When the equipment was packed away, Evan leaned against the wooden wall of the mill and looked toward the forest once more. The smoke had almost disappeared now, but the calm in the valley no longer felt natural. Something had shifted, and whatever had started that fire was unlikely to be the last move in the conflict forming around the land. The wind rustled the pines above them, carrying the scent of earth and water. The river flowed steadily, a reminder that life, like the valley, persisted, strong, resilient, and enduring. The next afternoon, the town office felt less like a government building and more like a courtroom. Tom Gray sat behind a heavy oak desk, his hands folded neatly over a stack of blueprints. He looked as composed as ever, but the air in the room was thick with a tension that hadn't been there 2 days ago. Evan sat across from him, the metal box from the mill resting on his lap. Nora stood by the window, her presence a silent, watchful shadow. "I have the documents you requested, Evan," Gray began, sliding a folder across the desk. "Detailed plans for the corridor. It's a standard industrial route. Nothing for the environmental board to lose sleep over." Evan didn't open the folder. Instead, he placed the metal canister, charred and smelling faintly of chemicals, directly on top of Gray's blueprints. The mayor's gaze dropped to the object. His expression didn't change, but his fingers twitched almost imperceptibly. "We had a fire yesterday," Evan said quietly. "Someone used an accelerant to try and push the flames into the reserve. If the wind had shifted, the mill would have been gone. My father's house, too." "Vandalism is unfortunate," Gray replied, his voice smooth. "But I fail to see what it has to do with our agreement." "It has everything to do with it," Nora interjected from the window. "Because the fire was set exactly where the boundary correction is. Someone wanted to clear that brush before a federal surveyor could see what's actually growing there." Evan opened the metal box and pulled out the maps Arthur had corrected 10 years ago. He spread them over Gray's blueprints, covering the modern CAD drawings with his father's precise, red-penciled lines. "My father wasn't just stubborn, Gray. He was right. This corridor you want doesn't just touch the reserve. It cuts through 40 acres of protected wetlands. Land that, according to these records, was never legally yours to develop." Gray leaned back, a small, cold smile forming. "Hand-drawn notes from a man who had a grudge against the county? That won't hold up in a courtroom, Evan. It's a delay tactic at best." "It's not just the maps," Evan said, leaning forward. "I called the county surveyor this morning. I told them I found Arthur's original filing, the one that mysteriously went missing from their office 8 years ago. I also mentioned the arson. Curiously, once the word arson was involved, their memory improved. They found the digital backups of the 2016 survey. The silence that followed was absolute. Gray's composed mask finally cracked. The warmth left his eyes entirely, replaced by a sharp, predatory stillness. "You're making a mistake," Gray whispered. "You could have walked away with enough money to never think about this dying town again. Now, you have a pile of rotting wood, a debt you can't pay, and a legal battle that will last a decade." Evan stood up, picking up the metal box, but leaving the maps and the canister on the desk. "I'm not selling, Tom. Not to you, and not for a road." "Then the bank takes it by winter," Gray snapped. "The bank already agreed to a restructuring." Evan lied. A bluff he knew Nora's foundation would help him make real by evening. "I'm reopening the mill. Not for timber. Nora's foundation needs a research and education center for the reserve. The buildings are solid, and the location is perfect. We're filing for a conservation easement tomorrow morning. The land is officially off the market." Gray stared at him, the realization sinking in that he had lost. The industrial hub was dead before the first stone was turned. Evan and Nora walked out of the office, through the quiet lobby, and into the bright afternoon sun of Oak Creek. The air was cool, carrying the scent of coming autumn. They walked back toward the river in silence until they reached the gravel clearing of the mill. Evan looked at the old structure. It still looked like an aging industrial scar, but for the first time, it didn't look like a burden. "You're actually staying?" Nora asked, stopping by the riverbank. Evan looked at the water moving steadily past the stones. He thought of his father, of the 12 years he'd spent running away, and of the red lines on the map that had finally brought him home. "My father spent his life protecting this place," Evan said. "I think it's time someone finished what he started." Nora smiled. a genuine, warm expression that reached her eyes. She held out her hand. "Welcome home, Evan." He took it, his grip firm. Behind them, the mill stood silent, but the shadows were no longer heavy. The sun hit the river, turning the water into a ribbon of brilliant, unbreakable silver. The conflict was over. The land had won.